Susan Smith, co-director of Women's Campaign Group for Women Scotland. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Susan, for the last 5 years, For Women Scotland has been campaigning against the Scottish Government's plans to make changing legal sex easier. Do you think that there is a common thread between the Scottish Government's plans to introduce gender self-ID and its plans to ban conversion therapy?
Yes, absolutely. There's what we've seen over the past few years is a suite of bills and policies that have been brought in really to enshrine ideas about gender identity into law and into society, to make it easier for people to self-ID and also to make it harder for people to raise objections and to point out some of the dangers to women and children that are posed by self-ID. We had the GRR bill, obviously, at the end of last year, that was pushed through and then blocked by the UK government. So we'll have to see what happens there. We also had the hate crime bill, which has received royal assent but isn't yet on the statute books, which it has some pretty draconian parts that we think would stop people being able to speak out so freely if it's enacted. And all this has been mapped out. It was mapped out in the Denton's report, which was a report that was commissioned from a law firm by some of the groups lobbying for these changes. And it's pretty explicit about some of the goals that we've been seeing in Scotland and about models in other countries like Norway and Malta and Ireland, and how you should be able to do things under the radar to attach policies to more popular policies in order to bury some of the things that people might object to. It's heavily focused on removal of parental rights and, as I say, making things appear palatable in order to get them through. And I think that, as with self-ID, if you don't look too closely under the bonnet, an end to conversion therapy sounds like a wonderful thing. Nobody would want people to be hurt or coerced. Nobody would want people to be victimized because of their sexuality, etc. But this isn't really, I think, what this proposal is about.
And what do you think about the evidence base for a new law? Do you think that a conversion therapy ban is needed?
There's very little evidence that some of the more, what one might call the more extreme varieties of conversion therapy have occurred, especially in recent years in the UK. I know you had Jo Bartosh on speaking to her, and she highlighted that the lack of evidence about who has been subjected to any of this. There was a 2018 report which said that 2% of LGBT people said that they had undergone conversion therapy. It wasn't actually defined though, and what was quite concerning from our point of view was that some of this conversion therapy was categorized as healthcare or psychological support, which starts to feed into what is potentially happening in some of the gender identity clinics and what we know has happened in other countries, where confused children are being offered only affirmative or validating psychological support. So they are not being questioned on some of the underlying reasons for having a gender identity confusion. So it seems as though there isn't the evidence base to support the fact that this is a widespread problem. Any coercive or violent or harmful practices would actually be illegal anyway. So if somebody was being tortured or subject to corrective rape or something like that, that would be illegal anyway. So it seems that what we end up talking about is therapy. And it's very concerning that this has become the major focus, that talking therapies are somehow being portrayed as problematic. And I think what we're missing actually is this massive elephant in the room when we talk about some of this. Our organisation for Women Scotland was co-founded by 4 people, 2 of whom were lesbian women, because they had seen some of the issues that are affecting lesbian women in spaces that were previously designed for them. And they had been at the university where there was a lot, frankly, of what I would describe as bullying and coercive behaviour from young men who had decided to identify as lesbians, basically straight young men who were coming into lesbian spaces, lesbian organisations, and demanding that their identities were affirmed by young lesbian women who were being told that they were bigots and transphobes if they would not consider them as dating potential. And to my mind, this is actual conversion therapy. The language that some of these people use when they speak about this is the language that we have been told is being used on gay children in other settings, but somehow it's acceptable when it's used on lesbian women by men who claim to be women. One of the issues that came out in Alison Bailey's case against her chamber and against Stonewall was that Stonewall had hired an individual who had run a workshop called Overcoming the Cotton Ceiling. And I don't know that necessarily your viewers will want me to go into too much detail about that, but essentially this is code, if you like, for trans-identified male people who want to persuade lesbian women to drop their objections to having sexual relations with fully intact male people. And the language is incredibly coercive. Some of the patterns of behavior that are noted are controlling. They are borderline, I would say they are bordering on criminal in some instances. The BBC did a big report on it a couple of years ago when a lot of lesbian women were interviewed about the pressures they felt they were under. Now, none of this would be captured by the proposal to outlaw conversion therapy, because this is coming from the same people who are proposing outlawing conversion therapy. So they are not interested in the sort of conversion therapy that is happening in these university groups, and they're certainly not interested in what is happening to children in some of the gender identity clinics. Hannah Barnes, of course, has recently released her book about what has happened in the Tavistock, and they felt they were witnessing the eradication of lesbian and gay youth. That a lot of this was driven by homophobic parents who would rather have a straight, in inverted commas, trans child than a gay child. And ironically, that is seen as acceptable. And in fact, when those clinicians tried to, or if they tried to get to the root of why these children were feeling confusion about their gender identity, whether it was to do with past abuse or their sexuality or a raft of other issues, they are being told that they are not being affirming, that they are attempting to convert them, and that this is bigoted. But the fact is, it's far more complicated and multi-layered than these people want us to believe.
To pick up on what you've said there, the Scottish Government's expert advisory group has recommended that parents who discourage their LGBT identifying children from pursuing trans identities could have their children taken away. And I was wondering if you could say something about what the implications would be for families where there are young girls really struggling with gender confusion.
Yes, it's absolutely horrific. And We know that the number of young girls who've been referred to gender identity clinics is growing exponentially. It shot up something like 4,000%. So we know that there are other things going on with this. We know that girls are more susceptible, especially in the teenage years and through puberty, to things like self-harm, to mental health problems. And we also know that this is a period where a lot of young girls feel hugely uncomfortable about getting attention of a sexual nature as they go through puberty. And in the past, this often resulted in girls suffering from anorexia, starving themselves to hide their bodies. And now, unfortunately, it seems like many girls are seeking refuge in pretending that they're not actually female after all. And this is, as I've said, especially the case for young lesbian girls. What we are being told is that in schools, being a lesbian girl is very uncool, that they are subject to bullying and harassment. But being a trans boy is considered very cool. So, and they get the attention, they also get the dates, funnily enough, that they would not have got as a girl. So there's huge societal pressure on young girls, as well as the mental aspect of girls who are struggling. We know schools are transing children behind their parents' backs, that they're not informing the parents of changes of names or pronouns. We know that organisations that have no expertise in education or child development are going into schools and telling teachers that if they do not do this, these children will kill themselves. And we know that they are encouraging teachers and children to believe that their parents are abusive if they prevent them from doing it. It's very concerning as well that under the initial proposals, when we go way, way back on self-ID, on GRR reform, there was initially an idea that children as young as 12 should be allowed to change their legal sex. And that was coupled with a suggestion that if parents didn't let them do that, the named person could step in. Now, as we know, the Scottish Government came somewhat a cropper with their named person scheme. But this is, again, it's all tied up and it's all part and parcel of some of these measures that have been conflated, that there is this attempt to allow state intervention into the lives of families to an extent that is unprecedented, really. We have seen this happen in countries like Norway, where children have been taken away from their families. And it's hugely disturbing that this is what is being proposed, because there's absolutely no grounds to suggest that worried, concerned parents who might want to seek out proper help for their children or any danger to their children whatsoever, what they are challenging is an orthodoxy that isn't rooted in anything other than ideology. And so it's ironic in a way that much of the objections to conversion therapy centre on the idea that this has been done by religious organisations, because actually the way this has been pushed is not based on anything other than ideology in and of itself, and probably has less respect for human dynamics and interaction. It's a cult of the individual, and it's a cult that the individual at any stage of their life is always right, and that children are always right. One of the things they say is that parents should not act as gatekeepers to healthcare. Well, that's really worrying. The idea that parents should not be allowed a say in whether their 11-year-old or the 12-year-old goes on to take extremely harmful drugs, which can result in lifelong medical problems for no good reason at all, is absolutely terrifying.
And in Victoria, Australia, not affirming someone's gender identity is unlawful conversion therapy, as is the refusal by parents to consent to their children being given puberty blockers, just like you've mentioned. The Scottish Government's expert advisory group wants to go even further than Victoria. Do you think that there's much support in Scotland for that kind of approach?
No, I don't. And I think that they should have taken a lesson from what happened with Named Person. Named Person was hugely unpopular. I don't think the general population of Scotland are sold on ideas around gender identity, and they're certainly not sold on ideas that the state could and should intervene with how they bring up their children. There is a sort of worrying nannying tendency amongst the SNP hierarchy, which where a lot of these ideas have been fomented, which is that they know better than other people and they need to swoop in. Now, obviously, there are always going to be families where there are problems. There are always going to be families who need assistance. There are always, sadly, going to be families where children are at risk. But the presumption, I think, that this policy and many others have started on is that all children are potentially at risk from their parents, and all parents are potentially bad, and that any parent who doesn't fit politically or ideologically with the government is even more suspect than most. I have seen people condemning parents who are homeschooling their children, and that might be for a variety of reasons. We know that people homeschool for all kinds of reasons, because their child has been bullied, or because they dislike some of the ideologies they're being faced with at school, or because they are struggling with their own mental health issues to deal with being in that sort of environment. So we know there's lots of reasons why people might choose to do that, but I've seen that being used as a reason to cast doubt on somebody's fitness to be a parent. I think it's very concerning that there is this drive by the state to act in loco parentis. The state can never replace a parent, and we should never be encouraging more children to be taken into care, because we know that children in care do not have the same outcomes as children who are in a happy family. So the fact that the state is almost actively trying to create more problems is absolutely terrifying. And we know, as I said before, we know that children who go on to take puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones will develop issues around bone density. They may have issues with their internal organs. There's issues around brain development. There's all sorts of health reasons why children should not be given these drugs. And for the state to be forcing parents to essentially do something that is against the best interests of the child is absolutely appalling. And at some point, if that happens, there will be lawsuits. Unfortunately, by the time that happens, the people who are responsible for this will have been long gone, and the children who are damaged by it will be adults dealing with the lifelong implications of that damage.
And do you think that people are open to persuasion on this issue? Is it a winnable argument?
I think when they know that we're not really talking about gay or lesbian people being strapped down and given electric shock treatment, which I think is what people immediately think. When you hear the words conversion therapy, that's what you think. And I don't think there are many people in Scotland who would not find that abhorrent. But the fact is that's illegal. So once it's been explained to them that this is not what we're talking about, that the reason this is being pushed through is to stop the sort of things that have already been identified by researchers, by doctors across the UK as causing incredible harm to young people. And that actually, as I said, in a bizarre way, this isn't so much of a preventative bill as a permissive bill, that it's allowing a different sort of conversion therapy to take place unhindered.
Susan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much.